Hello, everyone, and welcome to Good Conflict, using differences to drive performance with my guest speaker, Shannon Pearson. First, for anyone who may not know me, my name is Pascal Hansen. I'm the CEO and financial strategist at Zeta, and I'm also a tech chair with Tech Canada. So for those of you who are not familiar with Tech Canada, Tech, TEC, is the world's largest executive leadership development organization with 28,000 members worldwide, and it's dedicated to increasing the effectiveness of Canadian business leaders. So being a Tech Canada chair means that I facilitate monthly meetings for my CEO group, where group members learn from expert speakers from around the world, and they also form a peer advisory group to help each other with their business challenges. So a CEO group is not just for CEOs, it's for CEOs, presidents, founders, owners of businesses with more than 25 employees and 5 million in sales. So I'm starting a new CEO group in the Lower Mainland. So anyone who's interested in learning more about tech membership, please let me know in the chat and I'll reach out to you. I also have my fellow colleague here, tech chair in Saskatoon, Monica Wagner. She's building a group in Saskatoon for small business owners. So if that's of interest to you as well, if you know anyone in Saskatoon, please let us know. So now over to you, Shannon. Take it away.
Thanks, Pascal. Good morning, everybody. I'm Shannon Pearson, as Pascal pointed out. I'm here to talk to you about conflict. And before I get into the meat and potatoes of what that is, I always like to clear it up. It's not that I'm in conflict all the time, but I believe that conflict is very much a part of our day-to-day work environment. And using it as something to drive performance is a really productive skill to develop. And that's a lot of what I do. My day-to-day is working as a director of people and culture for a heavy civil construction company based in the Fraser Valley. So I am immersed in the practical reality of working with people day in, day out. So the work that I do is not just based in theory, but I bring a lot of that theory into the practical application of a live work environment with a lot of moving parts. So I'm going to share some of those things with you today. The name Reform IQ is the brand that I work under. And it is, to give you a little bit of background, the name Reform IQ came from the idea that everything that we want to change in a work environment typically, most of the time, is for the purpose of improvement. It's to improve an environment or improve a process. So change isn't necessarily a bad thing, but how we go about doing it is what makes it a really good experience, or perhaps less than a good experience for some people. So the form that we take in implementing change or transitioning people through change really matters. And IQ speaks to intelligence. I think most of us have used that or understand it to be a measure of intelligence. In the name Reform IQ, I consider that to be also the ability to reason. You may understand that change must happen or would be beneficial to happen, but being able to present that in a manner that speaks to the benefit of the greater good is really important. So as I said, I practice in people and culture every single day. I do love the work, but a little bit of an understanding about who I am is I'm a human behavior nerd completely. I do get fascinated in conflict through power dynamics, anything to do with brain science. I like to gobble it up. I'm a very curious individual. In the work that I do day to day, it's really about assessing and mitigating risk to an organization. And the way I do that is through mediation and facilitation, which sounds a little formal, but it's actually, I'm pretty relaxed. I'm also fairly relaxed in presenting. So, mediation sounds formal, but it's really just a conversation. I'm certified in third-party intervention, so we can make it formal at any time, but really it's just facilitating a conversation between people. And the way this came about was because I really messed it up at first. And that's always the beginning of a really good story. I got into consulting for business owners through a lens of operations and taking a look at things, thinking if there's a process and there's policies, surely people will follow them. And that is not the case. I can see yeah saying no. That's not the case. Essentially, what I learned in the hard way was people are going to do what they are going to do in order to feel like they matter in the context of what they're doing. So that's what led me down this path for many years now of really digging into what's motivating people. And the one thing I learned and what is really driving this presentation is when people don't feel relevant in the context of the work that they're doing, conflict will show up. It may not be overt, it may not be right away, but it will show up. So part of what I always want to drive with is a level of awareness. Understand what's motivating people, why the behaviors are showing up the way that they are. So we're going to talk about awareness in the context of the differences that we face in the workplace, how those differences lead into emotional responses, how to take that emotion and really reposition it and reframe it in a manner that drives towards performance. And all of this is under the umbrella of culture. So if we understand what motivates people, we understand that it's not always something that's obvious. It's not always on the surface. And everybody, I'm sure, in any type of culture presentation has seen this iceberg. Or a version of it. It's always a great representation of what happens in the work of culture. Getting stuff done is what we do on the surface. It's the tangible, it's the deliverables. We all see it. What we're always interested in when it comes to conflict or behavior is what's going on under the surface. So how we feel about the stuff we're getting done. We all know we have to get the stuff done, but how we feel about it really matters because it's the thoughts, the interpretation, the understanding. Is it aligned with the organization? Are there accountability practices in place? What is the culture? What is the person's individual culture? What are all these intangibles that are influencing how a person feels? And then what do they make it mean? Because all of these things, and this is endless. This is not a fully representative list of what goes on under the surface, but it always comes up. It bubbles up to the surface. So as things perhaps escalate for a person or their feelings become negative or anger starts to show up, it all bubbles to the surface and it might peak up and show people that there's emotion there, but it generally filters back down. But it doesn't necessarily go away. The reason I bring up the awareness piece all the time is because when you do not actually recognize what's coming up from under the surface, you're going to bump into a creature like this. And people use these the phrases, the elephant in the room, or it's under the surface. They use it all the time. But what doesn't generally get addressed is if we see an elephant in the room, who's talking to the elephant? Who's actually going up and saying, oh, I see you're an elephant. Welcome to the room. It doesn't generally get faced head on. So we're going to talk about that a little bit because you will not be able to ignore the elephant. It will go right back underneath the surface and it will stay there until something escalates again and then it'll pop its head back up. So the elephant in the room is a real thing. But what I like to talk about is what is the actual elephant? Because that's the part where we need to dig into what is actually driving, whether it be conflict, whether it be just simple behavior differences. And I do believe it's generated from differences that are maybe misunderstood or not fully understood. The emotion that comes as a result of those differences. And then something I call subjective assignment. And that's just my language because cognitive bias sounds a little bit clinical. So I tend to not say that. But that's ultimately what it is. Our subjective language and what we make something mean about somebody or something somebody did. So we're going to dig into this a little bit by starting with differences. In the work of HR, day to day, we are governed under employment standards or labor relations. But a couple other big things that come up are human rights code, bullying and harassment, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are standard frames of reference that come up in most environments I've worked in. So it's not to say that they're doing anything bad. It's just an awareness that's becoming more and more frequent in the workplace. So if we are governed by employment standards or labor relations, if we're in a unionized environment, where do we deal with human rights, bullying and harassment, which is WorkSafe, and diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's really the differences that we have between each other. And I always start with this type of information because it provides direction, it provides context. It's not really good form to walk around your place of employment and ask people how old they are. Not everybody really likes that. But I always try and get an understanding of when was a person born? What was going on in the world at the time? Because right now, we don't have a lot of people that are traditionalists in the workforce. They've retired. If they're there because they love the work and they want to be involved in the day-to-day. But we do have baby boomers, we do have Gen Xers, that's me, and of course the millennials and the Gen Z. It is a cross-section of experience that's coming to the table, but it's also a cross-section of things like communication styles, working styles, what motivates them, how do they form their expectations, and how do they communicate that back? Where this type of difference becomes really important is feedback and communication in general. I think the traditionalist is a great reference point. And I think of my father, who ran his own company for years. He was born in 1940. If I had to ask him to provide feedback to somebody that was in the workforce now, maybe in their mid-20s, graduated from university, very skilled, really know what they're doing, but I had to say, hey, we need to provide this person some feedback that they're great, they're valued, we really appreciate them, but we need the deliverables to happen in a more timely manner. The response would be more like, why? They just need to do their job. Just tell them to do their job. Meanwhile, that generation is looking for frequent, swift, and personal feedback. They want to know that they matter, that the time they're investing in your company is actually a good use of their time. Not just that you're the boss and you have deliverables that need to be met. So the communication style I see being very different between the generations. And there's a lack of awareness around that. So it does come up into the places that I mentioned on the previous slide, where we're looking at human rights. We're looking at employment standards as regulations and its law. So that is set. But then that filters down into human rights. It filters into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, if we get to a place where a person in a younger generation feels that they're being bullied, but a person in an older generation just feels like they're asking a person to do their job, it's still a conversation that has to happen. So those differences really show up on a fairly regular basis. And it's usually quite innocent. It's not because somebody wants to get into a fight or wants to get into an argument. It's literally the frame that they're looking through. So when people have different opinions of what is going on, they typically have a perspective and they're going to want to defend it. They're going to want to protect their point of view. The thing that I have learned about emotions is people will protect their point of view. And when that point of view gets challenged, they're going to double down. In a lot of cases, they're going to double down to really reinforce that protection. And I always use the picture of a peacock because I ask people to imagine you're walking through a park and a peacock fans its feathers out. It's a big display. So when people are defending something that's really important to them, they can turn it into a big display. And just like going and watching a peacock fan its feathers out, you generally will look at the peacock and say, wow, those are some nice feathers, or something along that line. You acknowledge it. It's really no different when emotion shows up, and especially in the workplace, because remember what I said earlier, when people are not feeling relevance in how they're showing up in the workplace, when they don't feel like they're getting noticed or recognized, that's where the conflict comes up. That's where the struggles start to show. So to put it in practical terms, when a person is coming at you with steam coming out of their ears and they're really heightened and really escalated, to dismiss or ignore it, just pretend that it's not there, is not going to work. It's really about recognizing what's there and understanding, having the awareness around why it's happening. If you don't, it may go back under the surface, just like the iceberg. It's going to go under the surface, but it will come back up to the surface when that trigger point gets hit again. So really, when it comes to emotions, I don't know about you guys, but I have heard through most of my career to really not leave room for emotion. That emotion, don't take things personally, and don't have emotion in the workplace. And or I would hear the terms like, well, just calm down, like just hear me out and calm down. And it's a very dismissive response. And it's not necessarily always intended that way. But if you follow a framework of going, well, we all have differences. Everybody sees things through their own lens. If you recognize that it's a perspective being shared, then allow room for that. If you don't allow room for that, a person's going to defend it. And when they defend it, you're probably going to run into some emotional response. The best option for that is to truly just look at them and say, wow, that's you're angry, or I can tell you're upset. What would you like to do next? Would you like a break? Would you like to continue talking? And ultimately help transition that conversation forward, not just stay stuck in the emotional state. The thing about conflict resolution is it's not an exact science. The intergenerational workforce information, it's not an exact science. It's a frame of reference. Same with conflict resolution styles, which I have on the screen right now. There's the two directions. We have assertiveness and cooperative. When you have people that deal with emotions or defending their position and they are competing personality, they compete in their conflict resolution style, they're not so high on the cooperative side. They're going to do what they need to do to get the win, whatever it is that they perceive to be the win. The interesting thing about this type of thing is understanding when a person is a competing person and another person is avoidant in conflict. It's actually a great situation for the competing personality, but not so much for the person that likes to avoid conflict. So what this type of information provides a person is the ability to understand what is driving the behavior that you're seeing in the conflict, and then position yourself accordingly. If you know you have somebody that's a competing person, going at them head to head is probably not going to get you to a place of cooperative. It's not going to get you to a place of harmony in the workplace. It's going to be a power dynamic's going to come up of it. If you have somebody that's accommodating, what you might compromise is real innovation, real collaboration. So it's not that any one is better than the other. Some are more cooperative, some are more assertive, and there's a time and a place for versions of all of them. But putting a person who's avoidant of conflict into a position where they have to face conflict is not the kindest thing to do. So again, recognizing who's who and how they operate, what drives them, what motivates them for the responses that you're looking for. This type of information is incredibly important because, again, this is never going to respond well to calm down. Never, ever. It's acknowledging the emotion is absolutely critical if we're going to use the emotion and the differences that we have to move through to more of a collaborative, innovative, cooperative environment. And that's ultimately what we're usually after with the corporate culture. So one of the things I always like to find out with this awareness that I keep talking about is not just if somebody's in conflict, and I call it the good fight because I think that conflict can be really, really healthy. It can actually drive to some really great results. but not if you're just focusing on the fight, right? If you're just talking about what you're fighting about, you're not actually focused on what you're fighting for. So the conflict shows up for a reason. So we need to understand why it matters. What are people so excited about? We need to get to that. We need to get down to that root cause. Because when emotions show up, they're predictive. I believe that they are something, they're like a flag that's waving in the wind and it's here to tell you something. So pay attention to it. The other thing to recognize when emotion shows up is people talk. They're going to talk good. They're going to talk bad. They're going to talk. And they have a right to. They have a right to confide in their peers and their friends and their family. It's going to happen. But when you see the emotions spark, recognize it as something to address because it's predictive of something else. If you don't manage it, it's going to be a prediction of future events. It's also going to be shared with other people. So managing it and containing it is probably a best practice, I would say, in most case scenarios. And also remember, like I said earlier, typically when people start to get scrappy, they're protecting something and they want to be seen and heard. There's a relevance that they're looking for. And when they go and talk about it with their peers, they're asking for buy-in. They're looking for confirmation on the position that they hold. So really, when the emotion shows up, it's an opportunity to get to the root cause. And that is really critical in terms of communication. There's a really interesting piece of, I guess it was an experiment that was done in the 60s. When we are communicating with each other and we're talking about something very generic like the weather, the information comes at us and it's given to us through body language, facial expression, the cadence we speak in, how fast we're talking, the tone of voice we have, and then the words, the verbal. So there's three areas of conveyed meaning. It's all information that's coming at us. In this experiment, which was done by Albert Mehrabian, I think I said his name right. I usually butcher it, so that's good. It was in the late 60s. He was a professor at the University of California, and he did this experiment to find out what happened to our communication style when emotion rose. So when we're emotionally engaged in what we're talking about, if we make some assumptions and say that when we're talking about generic information like the weather, and we split the visual, vocal, and verbal up to a third, a third, a third, that's our assumption. Then all of a sudden we talk about something that's incredibly important to us. We're emotionally invested in it. It changes to 55%, 38%, and 7%. So what this experiment showed was that, and what people made it mean, and I'm going to debunk it now, so spoiler alert. People walked around saying, well, words don't matter. Obviously what we're saying doesn't matter. And that wasn't the purpose. And actually, Dr. Mehrabian went on to his website and actually said, this is not about words or not words. This is about emotions and how we communicate when we're emotional. By the math that you see on your screen there, what it's saying is 93% of what we're communicating comes across in the visual and vocal elements of our conversation. And the words just make up 7%. When you put it in the context of something like this, it makes a lot of sense. Because when somebody's coming at you hot, you're not probably listening to what's actually being said. You're paying more attention to what you're seeing. Am I safe? Do I need to defend myself? Are they mad at me? Or are they just mad? Like, what do I need to get a bat? Like, what is going on? So you're assessing all those core needs. Like, am I safe? How do I respond to this? What do I do? So again, not an exact science, but a really interesting experiment. And I have a really great story to share with you on that point. When people are communicating with each other and they're really attached to a point that they want to make, but they show up and they do something, they behave in a way, or they have a facial expression, or their body language is different, it doesn't match what they're saying. Pay attention to it. When things are not congruent, it's a big flag. In the work of culture, I see this fairly often, especially when there's a power dynamic, when there's somebody that's wanting to exert authority over something or someone. but they're not quite getting there. They're going to try different tactics. This happened to me quite a few years ago. I was in a position, I was on a long-term contract in a management position in HR. And the leadership team had come to me and said, this certain individual wants to be on the safety committee, and we do not want him there. And they had their reasons. They said, he's going to come to you. The answer is no. So handle it. And I really thought nothing of it because I had the information. I understood where they were coming from. I had some information about him and his conduct, and it made sense. But what this gentleman did, he had to bring me an envelope on a day. He had information he had to give to me for his file. He walked into my office and he handed me the envelope, and I said, thank you. And then he went directly in front of me across my desk, made two fists and hammered them on the top of the desk and leaned forward at me. So it was very aggressive. And there was no other context to it. He just did that and leaned forward. And then he said very gently, I just want to help. I really think I should be on the safety team. He had taken up so much space in my office just with his posturing. And this is where my human behavior nerd thing shows up, and I get really curious. And I didn't, instead of jumping up and mirroring him in a power move, I got very relaxed and I just sat back in my chair and I said, and I did the same thing. I did not match my demeanor. My demeanor was very relaxed and very calm. And I said, I know you do, and I appreciate it, but the answer is no. And it's a final decision. Thank you for the envelope. And off he went. We managed it more after. It wasn't just like we never talked to him about it again. But I've never forgotten it, because when somebody comes in and takes a dominant position like that, but then speaks very gently and warmly, it does create this dynamic where you're wondering what the heck is happening and what's going to happen next. It is a very big flag that there's something you need to dig into, because when people are thinking and doing different than what they're saying, something is going to come up to the surface. And I've never been wrong about that. I'm happy and unhappy to say. But I've used it as a very good thermometer in managing situations like that. So the last thing I want to get into is probably the most subtle and complicated, but it's incredibly impactful in a work environment. It's not me, it's you, which is really about dismissing somebody in a moment with their, however they're feeling or whatever they're trying to express, just dismissing it like it's not that big of a deal. So what this speaks to is what I call the subjective assignment. People making assumptions based on how they see a situation or how they view a person, the lens that they look through. The problem with it is a bias, and it reinforces division. And division in an environment it can get quite toxic. So not contributing to it would be ideal if it exists at all. Creating division is very dangerous. It's quite a slippery slope. It discourages people from coming forward, not just with concerns. It actually discourages people from coming forward, period. Even with the great ideas. So if they believe that they're being seen in a certain way, there is no safety to come forward. It's an erosion of trust. If anybody has not read The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, I would highly recommend it. It gives some really good context to the topic of trust in a team and how it is a foundational piece. But it's not trust the way we throw the word trust around just in our everyday life. It's trust about, can I depend on you to have my back? Can I come to you with anything and you and I are on the same team? We're going to collaborate to get to the end game. It's a deeper version of trust than just that surface level. So when you compromise that, it's really difficult to come back from it. It's definitely doable and worth every single effort, but it's very dangerous to a culture. The subjective assignment or cognitive bias that is the the one that I see the most, and I think I could honestly say I've probably done myself. It's an easy thing to do. It's called the fundamental attribution theory, or the fundamental attribution rule. It's referred to that as well. It states that we attribute another's actions as a result of their personality or their character, while attributing our own to circumstances that are out of our control. So if we take an example of a pop quiz and you have two people, somebody comes in, does the quiz and fails. I come in, do the quiz, and I ace it. I look at that person and go, well, they're obviously not that intelligent, so that's why they failed. I worked really hard and I'm quite intelligent, so I aced it. The other thing can happen where let me back up. When the person that has failed and we make this assumption that it's because they're not that intelligent, what could have happened is many things, but let's just say in that scenario, the person received a phone call before they did the pop quiz and got some very upsetting information about a family member. So they were completely distracted. Their failing the quiz had nothing to do with their intelligence level. But because we don't have all the information, we're making this subjective opinion about them. The same can be true where that person aces it and I fail it. That person aced it because they were lucky. I failed it because I'm so busy. I had to mix all my priorities around and I just didn't have the time to study because I was saving the world. So it's this very, when you get an opinion about somebody and you've used that as a tool to make your decisions, that's where it becomes a slippery slope and it becomes very dangerous because you're not actually looking at the person in apples to apples with anybody else. The perception that you have of their character is now going to be driving decisions that are made. Those decisions are made about the person and potentially their future. So the fundamental attribution theory is a cognitive bias that is common. And when you do not exercise awareness and open curiosity to really dig into a person and what they're operating with, why they're operating with it, and what's triggering all the events along that chain of events that happen, you can get into a pretty dangerous place with the fundamental attribution theory, and it affects people's lives. The story I want to share with you, the head and heart connection story, I do have permission from the person who this is about. I did sit down with her and she gave me the green light to share this, and I'll get into that a little bit. I had an opinion about a woman named Catherine. She was just a nightmare employee. It was just, she was volatile and she was shooting her mouth off and it was unacceptable. It was against the code of conduct. It was all these things. So this is a story that dates back quite a few years. I was working in a production facility. And on this day, I had had a number of complaints about Catherine and the way she was talking to people. And I kid you not, she was telling people where to go in not a very nice way. And there's about 120 people in this production plant. So because of what I didn't know and also what I knew, I had this framework of, that's it, I'm done. I'm going to bring her up here and I'm going to give her a last chance agreement. And if she doesn't change her attitude, I will fire her. And it was just a very simple equation in my head. I did another thing where I got on a radio and went to the open channel and I broadcast throughout the entire production floor, send Catherine to my office. So they knew a lot of complaints had come because the complaints all bubbled up to the surface. I wanted everybody to know that I was handling it. So just stop worrying about it. I will take care of it. In the time it took Catherine to get to my office, somebody stopped by and said, she's never been the same since last year. I said, why is that? And I was still pretty angry. And the person said, oh, her son died. And all my anger went to confusion, went to, oh no. And what am I going to say now? Because Catherine was in my office. It was less than a minute between the time I found that information out, that person walked down the hall and Catherine was in front of me. There was a very lengthy conversation that took place, and I'll spare you the details of that. Catherine was a very angry woman. I had to get her to share with me the information I just found out so that we can contextualize it with just the two of us. The question I asked was, "What is going on for you?" And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Because there's 119 people down on the production floor and nobody's telling anybody where to go and how to get there. But you are. So I figured there might be a reason." And she just didn't care. She was not engaged at all. So I convinced her to tell me something so that I had a chance at helping her, because right now it wasn't looking good. She went on to tell me the story about her son, and it was incredibly tragic. The reason she was acting out in that time frame was because victim services had called her, and the man that took her son's life was going to be appearing in court. And so not only was she dealing with grief still, she also had to face the person that created the situation for her. It was a very difficult conversation for me to navigate carefully because I had great empathy for her, but I also knew I had 119 other people on a production floor waiting to find out what's going to happen. She's in trouble. And it was that kind of place. So my mind was split between this deep empathy of hearing this tragic story and this mom. She wasn't even an employee at that point. She was a mom, and she was angry. And I gently and thankfully was able to use humor. And I just,
It looks like we lost Shannon, so hopefully she's going to come back in right in the middle of her story too. I'm just gonna wait for her to come back.
Yeah, hopefully she can come back and has power. Though we've almost lost power a couple times here in Mission today because of the wind.
Oh, that might be what's okay. So that
Yeah,
might be what's happening.
I think Shannon's out in Hope or Chilliwack somewhere, isn't she?
Yeah, she's out in what I call the boonies. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just I'm just gonna go off and I'm gonna call. Okay, so Shannon didn't lose power. She's gonna log back on. So I don't know what happened. So just hang tight. She'll be right back with us. Technology is great when it works, not so great when it doesn't. So while we wait for Shannon to come back on, yeah, do you have can you relate to anything she was talking about? What's your experience working with business owners in conflict?
Yeah, no, I find this fascinating because she's looking at, these things from a pretty different perspective as I do. But everything is valid. So one of the most interesting observations that I've had when I go into a client, which usually is blue collar, business, I do these open brainstorms around the question, what can we do better here? What is that you don't like about the business? And I do one with the management team. And then I do one with staff, where there is no management in the room. So they are open to talk. And what I found is that when I do this with the management team, they're talking about all this stuff that they don't like about their personnel, their staff. And this is going wrong. We have these processes, but they are not following them, and they're sort of basically pointing at the staff for all the problems that they have. And then I sit down with the staff and I do this open brainstorm. And basically they're complaining. I mean, 95% they're complaining about the same stuff, but they're pointing at the management.
Yeah.
And so and then I go back to the management and I clarify, what happened and all the comments that they have, and I have a big form on the wall with all, full with stickies. And it's like, there's alignment here, between all the complaints that you guys have. And then of course my internal voice says, why did you guys never talk to each other? But they don't. And so they need an outsider, to come in and start that discussion. I've done these, now a number of times over the last few years. And, that's probably one of my biggest, surprises and findings that I've had, that these guys are aligned. And then, once we know what's going on, and so I assume that Pascal is still in there in the background. Once we know that what everybody's is thinking and about all the issues that they have and that they know about within the business, now we can start working on those and tackling and make improvements. So sort of back to Pascal's question, all these personnel complaints and issues, in many cases, the root cause for those, lie in the operation, in the processes that are followed or not being followed, in the management, how they act, and the management practices that they use or the lack thereof. That's that's where the underlying causes usually are for poor morale and leading to sometimes retention issues, which Shannon mentioned right in the beginning of her presentation.
I can concur. Yeah. In facilitating, a lot of times if it's two groups that they say they're getting along well now and they just want to cement the relationship, and I do phone interviews, and when they have the same questions for both groups, all they do is point the fingers at the other group, right?
Yeah.
So when you bring that to light in a meeting, it's like you're on the same side. You really are truly on the same side, but you need to solve the problems together. So the same takeaways for me.
Yeah, that's no, that's good to hear, Monica.
Okay, so I emailed Shannon the link and I just went off camera because she was calling me, and for some reason she can't get into Zoom. So I emailed her from my Outlook and my Gmail. So I'm just going to give her a few more seconds. If she can't log on, what I'll ask her to do is just record the entire session and then send it to us, and then I can share it with you. So unfortunately, I don't know, that's a techie thing. It happens. So
Yeah, that's a bummer because I really enjoyed this.
I know, right at the highlight. Anyway, what I will send you beforehand is the conversation I did have with Shannon, because she actually goes through the entire story. So technology cut her off halfway through. But in the conversation I had with her, she actually gets to the end of it. And I think it was the end of her presentation anyway. So that's the best we can do. And again, I apologize.
Well, there's
No
nothing
No
you can
problem,
do
it
about it, so.
happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the weather on